Welcome to the Real Estate Investor Summit podcast, coming to you straight from the smallest big town in Texas with your host, mentor, and owner financing master, Mitch, aka Be the Bank Steven. The possibilities of life without a JOB start here. So grab your pen and paper and listen up. Y'all just might figure out how to fail forward to financial freedom.
This is Mitch, and welcome to the Real Estate Investor Summit podcast. This is your all-knowing and wonderful host, Mitch Steven. Today, it's just you and me, baby, just us. We're going to talk about conquering fear, and we're going to get right to it right after a word from our sponsors. Stand by. Yep, this is Mitch. I just love those sponsors. Thank you very much. You're what makes my world go round. All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to talk about fear. You know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Fear is an unpleasant and often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. Fear can be the most paralyzing state. It can keep you from making even the most simple decisions. It can keep you from making the next step, no matter how simple it is. And in its most powerful form, fear can cause a person to lose their ability to scream or even to speak. Fear can cause people to faint or pass out or even black out, losing substantial blocks of time out of their memory. Fear can also override your involuntary muscles. Have you ever heard the familiar description, hey, that scared the crap out of me? Well, there's a reason why they use that all familiar and frequently used description of fear. Because in a true fight or flight or life or death situation, more than one soldier has reported the spontaneous emptying of their bowels when faced with almost certain death. I won't pretend to know the answers to how to handle that kind of fear because I haven't ever been there. God bless the soldiers that have. But I do want to talk to you about a more basic fear. Let's talk about that level of fear that affects all of us more often than not, but it's not life-threatening. Fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of criticism, fear of loss, fear of change, fear of the unknown. What will happen if you step outside of the person the world knows you to be and you try something out of character? What will happen if you fail and the risk to set you back financially? What will happen? Will your spouse disavow you? Will you lose your home? Will you be the talk of the town? Hey, did you hear what old Johnny did back there? He went crazy, man. He went out and tried something different and lost everything. I mean, are you going to be the rumor mill? I want to talk to you about that kind of fear. The fear of things that aren't nearly about to kill you. Let's talk about risk and reward and how to deal with the fear and how to minimize the risk and overcome the fear. After 20 plus years, it's easy to look back and see some of the turning points in my career. Those turning points weren't so obvious at the time, but now I can see them clearly in my rearview mirror. One of those turning points happened to be when I was talking to a friend and mentor, Carlos Bolito. Early on, I came to know this very successful businessman named Carlos Bolito, and he is a Cuban, and to this day he speaks with a very heavy Cuban accent. As a young man, he was forced to seek political asylum in the USA because he was fleeing from Cuba because of Fidel Castro and his murderous regime. At 18, Carlos volunteered to train in the hills of Guatemala to become one of the Cuban freedom fighters. This was a top secret, highly classified mission. The freedom fighters were secretly training with the help of the U.S. and had plans to return to Cuba and defeat Castro and communism. But things didn't work out so well. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had approved the clandestine military force, was defeated by Kennedy in a stunning upset before the invasion was able to take place. And one of the most perfect strategic attacks ever planned failed miserably when Kennedy refused to send the necessary air support. All the air support had to do was defend about a 27-mile-long strip-wide pinch at the top of the peninsula where the freedom fighters were going to be unloaded with all their supplies and all their gear. But the planes never came, and the freedom fighters were captured and slaughtered in a battle called the Bay of Pigs, which was dubbed by Fidel Castro the Bay of Pigs because he deemed those Cuban fighters to be traitors to their country. We all know who the real traitor was. The real traitor was Fidel Castro. So my friend Carlos was captured in that battle. He was not killed, but he was captured and held prisoner as a traitor to his country for about 2.5 years. and he was not treated very well. In fact, he was brutalized more days than he was not. So, when I met Carlos, those days of discontent were far, far behind him. But I was so curious about how someone lives in that kind of stress. He was many years my senior, and I admired his business acumen, and we used to talk for hours. I mean, literally hours. And he told me the story, and I remembered him saying that his life was worth one John Deere tractor and a box of medical supplies, because that's what Amnesty International gave for him and about 24 other prisoners that they released on that day. And so I asked Carlos, how do you forgive a country that betrayed you so badly? And he said, and I will never forget, he said, the United States of America is the greatest country ever invented. The men who run it will always be imperfect, some better than others, and God willing, they will come and they will go. And I never forgot what he said. He didn't judge this country by the men who run it. He judged it by the principles on which it was built on. And I think that's really important for us to acknowledge and to revisit just what a blessing we live in this country, to be in this country. And then I asked him, how did you survive all those days of torture and darkness, not knowing there would ever be an end to it? And then Carlos said something else that I have never forgotten. And it was the catalyst for me jumping off and becoming an entrepreneur. He said, the human body is the most adaptable thing on the planet. And if you give it just enough protein and just enough water, and if the mind doesn't go, it will figure out everything. And man, I was at a crossroads in my life and I needed to hear this. You ever heard that saying that the teacher will appear when the student is ready? It was one of those moments. I was ready to hear this, and to a lot of other people, this might have just been some kind of statement that sounded grandiose or something, but this was really talking to me. And when I heard his testament to the strength and the ability of the human body, it haunted me for days, maybe even weeks. Here I was, a young man in my mid-20s, floundering around under a glass ceiling, held in place for those who did not obtain a college degree, for I had not obtained one. I forfeited my time for that. And at the time, I was hardly able to make about $15 per hour, and no matter how good or dedicated or innovative I was, advancement was never fast enough, if at all. And I found myself growing older and staying at the same pay scale. And I had already started to contemplate not having a job, but I was afraid. This brings us back to the fear that we're talking about. My mind kept returning to what Carlos had said about the human body being the most adaptable thing on the planet. And I absolutely knew it was true. I believed every word of it. And I went over and over and over his statement. And I'll read it again to you. The human body is the most adaptable thing on the planet. And if you give it just enough protein and just enough water, and if the mind doesn't go, it will figure everything out. I went over it and over it. The sentence was trying to tell me something, and it was speaking right to me because I was ready to hear it. I couldn't get out of my head. I had been contemplating going on my own, quitting the entire idea of having a job. It was already in my mind. I had already been trying to figure out, how was I going to do it? How did I muster the courage? What if I failed? What if this? What if that? And the fear was stopping me from doing it because I was going into the unknown. I had no idea what was going to happen. And then right there, right in front of me, was my answer. The human body is the most adaptable thing on the planet. And I started to reason with myself. Wow. If something happened to me and I could not have a job, would I die? I mean, what were the chances that I would not find enough protein/food living in the United States of America in San Antonio, Texas? What are the chances that I'm not going to be able to find food? I didn't think the chances were very good at all. I thought there's enough in this country. It's one of the greatest things about this country. If you can't find food, you're not trying too hard. What are the chances that I'd be deprived of water, good, clean water in this country? Practically impossible. So I believed Carlos when he said, the human body is the most adaptable thing in the world. And I knew if having a job was going to be removed from my options, my body would figure out everything. It would have to. It would have to figure out everything. It would be forced to. The food and the water were just the two parts of the equation. And I wasn't even at all worried about having enough food or water. But there was this third part, that part about the mind. And in Carlos's sentence it was, and if the mind doesn't go. So in Carlos' statement, he was talking about sanity. In prison, if you got just enough food and water, and if you didn't go insane, the body would figure everything out. But in my case, it was going to be a little bit different. I wasn't even in prison. I wasn't even getting the crap beat out of me every day. I wasn't even being pissed on and shoved around and threatened with my life. You know, I wasn't even near that kind of stress to worry about insanity. What I had to worry about and where if the mind doesn't go, to me it meant I'd have to resist the temptation of returning to the job, returning to a job, even when things got tough. This is where I had to hold my mind. This is where I had to keep control of my mind. It would be up to me to keep my mind from giving up and then going back into a job if I was going to push my body to figure out what the heck it was going to do to become independent. So I resolved to take having a job off the table. And I figured it would be tough. I figured it was going to be real tough, even tougher than I was even prepared for. I figured it would be. But I knew my destiny lay beyond this struggle. If I was going to get to where I wanted to be in life, I'd have to endure what my decision to not have a job threw at me. Resisting a job was going to be the key for me. That was if my mind doesn't go. And I knew I'd be able to muster food, and I knew that I'd be able to have water. I wasn't worried about that. The trick was going to be to push my body out of a job for so long until it had no other choice but to figure out what it was going to do to become independent. I figured I was going to hit bottom. I knew I was probably going to be quite embarrassed about what happened. I kind of figured I might. I knew I'd have to go it alone for a while and forget about relationships with the opposite sex, because after all, who's going to want to, run around with a guy who's fixing to be broke for a while? I knew it was going to be lonely. I knew it was going to be tough, and at the time I had no wife and I had no children, so I was making this decision solely for myself. But I prepared for a long, cold war, and my mantra became, they can't eat me. I can fail, I can fall down, I can not have money. They can do whatever they want to with me, but they cannot eat me. And as long as I'm not doing anything illegal, they're not going to be able to put me in jail. So I'm going to be a free man on the street. They can't eat me, and this body's going to have to figure out what to do to become independent. Now, FYI, I never hit the worst case scenarios that were imagined in my mind. One is just because I worked too hard. I work. I had a goal, and I worked hard. And having a little fear is good. It gets you up and out the door in the mornings. But 90% of all the things we worry about never come to pass. And it was true here too. I was worried about all these things of how long is it going to take me to figure out how to make, $50, $60, $80, $100 a day. Just so I can have a comfortable place to live and some food and some gas in my gas tank and make my car payment. So I wasn't sure. So in the second phase of overcoming fear, I started creating an environment where I could fail without collapsing. Failure was figured into my plan up front, and failure wasn't figured in because of lack of confidence or optimism. The failure was figured in because inevitably failure seems to find its way into every resume of every successful and ultra successful person I've ever known or read about. So I figured, it's going to happen to me too, so I've got to plan for this failure. So why not plan for it up front? And that's when the moat theory was born. And the moat theory 1 and the moat theory 2 can be found in my book, My Life in 1,000 Houses, Failing Forward to Financial Freedom. And I didn't know it at the time, but what I had done is I had set myself up so that if I failed, I didn't collapse. In how you do that, in short, the moat theory, we plan for the worst case scenario, and then we give ourselves permission to fail under 2 conditions. The first condition being that we've built a modest cash flow income stream that covers our basic needs. In order to really go out there and fail without fear, you've got to have a cash flow stream that comes in that's covering your basic needs. Food, water, place to live, car payment, just the basics. And then number 2, we never risk that cash flow income stream when we aspire for more. We always leave that sacred so that when we go out to aspire for more and we charge out into the world and we fail miserably, there's this place that we can retreat to, our reservation, that has everything that we need. And we can rest there and rebuild and rebuild our stockpiles and rebuild our energy and have our wounds heal so that we can save up a little extra and go out there again and again and again until we figure out our place. I think the first thing is you have to be aware that fear is holding you back or somehow detrimental in your life, I think that's the first step. Once you realize you are actually afraid, and this is affecting your decision-making processes, you can set out to overcome the fear. But you have to be aware first. And then you need to recognize that fear can be a good thing. Fear can work for you. It can cause you determination, and it can cause you perseverance. For example, if you're afraid of getting old without an income, the fear of poverty could drive you to become financially independent. Without fear, there's no action. Fear is a great motivator. Learn to identify exactly what you're afraid of. This is critical. If you know exactly what you're afraid of, you can get more specific as to how to conquer that specific fear. For example, if you're afraid to quit your job because you're not going to be able to pay your bills, perhaps you should work part-time to create an income stream to cover those bills before you quit your job. See, once you figure out exactly what you're afraid of, then you can start to mitigate that fear. Prepare for failure whenever possible. Having a good plan B can go a long way towards thwarting fear. In my first phase of facing fear, I'd prepare for failure. I'd either come up with an alternative plan for it if I failed, or I'd deduce what the worst case scenario was, and if I could live with the worst case scenario, then I would proceed. But I was mitigating my fear. If you fear something big, try breaking it down. Sometimes the magnitude of the situation is what makes us fearful. You know, it's a big mountain to climb. It's hard to start from the bottom. Try cutting down the problem into segments and tackle the most logical or minimal segment first. Because reducing a big problem into several smaller problems is when we start to see the entire situation to be overcomable. That's a word. Is overcomable a word? And have a worthy goal. When your why is bigger than your fear, things start getting done. A strong why keeps you focused and keeps you moving through the challenging times. Having a good reason helps us conquer fear. So have a great why. Have a big why. Fear is conquered by massive action. When I was laying awake at night during the 2008 recession, wondering how I was going to handle the ever-mounting foreclosures I was going through, and I think it finally stopped around 45 foreclosures in 90 days. I was sweating pools of sweat in my bed. For about 7 days there, I was mortified that my life and all the good things I had done and the business I built was going to collapse around me. And then one day I woke up and said, if it collapses, it's not going to collapse because I didn't get out there and fight. And I got out there and rolled up my sleeves and fought like I've never fought before. And surprisingly enough, I solved the problem in like 45 days. I solved all of it. And there was a real silver lining behind all those problems. So if you're in a fearful state right now, perhaps you're out of work or something unimaginable has happened, how do you handle fear when you're swallowed up by it? Well, I say you go on the attack. You engage it head on. If you're busy fighting, you won't have time to be afraid. That's one thing it does. Taking massive action and jumping right in the fray and starting to swing your sword and hold up your shield, you start to where you don't have time to be afraid anymore. And you'll probably find that the giant that you're fighting isn't as enormous as you first thought it was. When you start to gain on things you fear the most, your fear will start to reduce exponentially. You go out there to fight Goliath and you have your shield and your sword and you know, this is not how the story goes, but this is your story, not David's. So you go out there to fight a Goliath and you swing the sword and you accidentally chop off half Goliath's left arm. Hey, we're making ground. He's half the man he was now. He has no shield anymore. He just has that sword. It's a terrible analogy, but you get my drift. Once you start having just a little bit of success with your massive action, your confidence starts to move exponentially. And the size of your opponent seems to shrink exponentially. You'll start to gain a certain momentum that starts to grow in your favor. So take massive action. One of the most rewarding things you can do in life is to conquer your fears. Take on your fears head on, and overcoming them can open up new doors and present new horizons. It can lead to choices previously unavailable and paths previously inaccessible. So once you conquer that fear, different avenues open up because you are no longer afraid of what used to hold you back. You are in a new frontier now. So next time you realize that fear is keeping you from accomplishing more in your life, try to remember these key points about fear. Be aware that fear is holding you back. Recognize that fear can be good. Identify your exact fear. Prepare for failure whenever it's possible. Break down your fears into smaller pieces. Have a great why and read your goals often. Take massive action and become too busy to be afraid. And there you go. You get you some Mitch Stephen and Conquering Fear today. It's just you and me, baby, and I hope that if you've been living in a fearful state, that maybe this was a little help for you. Be sure to write in the comments of the iTunes Real Estate Investor Summit podcast, and if anybody out there wants to give me a 5-star review, I'd be more than grateful, because I'm not famous, and it's reviews from people like you that make my world go around. The only reason anyone tunes in is because of 5-star reviews from people just like you. This is Mitch, and we're out of here.
You've been listening to the Owner Financing Master, Mitch Be the Bank Stephen, on the Real Estate Investor Summit podcast. Let us now blatantly, without apology, bribe you towards financial freedom by offering you a whole bunch of free stuff. Go to reinvestorsummit.com and get you some. And y'all come back now, you hear?